It started the first summer after her mother passed away. Each evening, when the light turned gold and the air smelled of warm grass, Eliza would walk to the meadow behind her cabin and hum the same song her mother used to sing while cooking. At first, it was just for herself, a quiet way to remember. But one evening, halfway through the familiar tune, she noticed movement at the edge of the woods. A massive brown bear stepped from the shadows, its head tilted slightly, its dark eyes fixed on her. She froze. The bear didn't advance. Instead, it sat, perfectly still, and listened until the song ended. Then it turned, disappearing back into the trees without a sound. The next night, she sang again. And again, the bear came. The first time it happened, Eliza convinced herself it was a one-off, a fluke of timing, nothing more. She'd been humming The Willow's Lullaby, a song her mother had sung every night before bed when she was a child, and perhaps the sound had simply carried far enough to draw a curious animal from the tree-line. But when she returned the next evening, the meadow bathed in the same honeyed light, and began to hum again. There was the faint rustle of leaves from the forest's edge. Her heart thumped. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon as the notes left her throat, steady but softer now. And then it appeared. The same massive brown bear, its fur thick and sun-warmed, moved forward until it reached the exact same spot as before. It sat, the way a person might lower themselves into a chair, and faced her with unwavering attention. Eliza's fingers tightened on the hem of her shirt. Every instinct told her to stop, to walk away slowly, but something in the bear's stillness felt different from danger. It wasn't poised to lunge. It wasn't restless. It was waiting. When she reached the final note, the bear blinked once, rose to its feet, and padded back into the trees without so much as a branch snapping underfoot. By the third evening, she was ready for it. She positioned herself in the same patch of grass, waited until the shadows lengthened, and began the song. Sure enough, the bear appeared again. For an entire week, they repeated the ritual. Eliza would hum, the bear would listen, and when the song ended, they would part ways. She didn't tell anyone at first. How could she explain it without sounding unhinged? To the townsfolk, bears were dangerous, something to be avoided or scared off. And yet here she was, standing in an open meadow each night with nothing between her and a half-ton of wild muscle but a handful of gentle notes. On the 8th evening, the air felt heavier, the way it does before a storm. Clouds gathered low over the mountains, turning the sunlight a deep amber. Eliza hesitated on her porch, hand resting on the doorframe. Part of her told her to skip the meadow that night, but the pull of the routine, and the quiet companionship she didn't quite understand, was stronger. She walked out, the grass cool and damp beneath her boots. At the familiar spot, she took a deep breath and began to hum. The wind carried her voice in thin, wavering strands toward the forest. A minute passed before she saw movement. The bear emerged, but this time it didn't stop at the tree-line. Instead, it walked forward, slow and deliberate, closing the distance between them until only 30 feet remained. Eliza's throat tightened, but she kept humming. The bear's eyes never left her face. It didn't huff or shift its weight, it simply lowered itself onto its haunches closer than it had ever dared before. Her mind ran through every warning she'd ever heard: don't feed it. Don't run. Don't break eye contact. Keep calm. She willed her body to stay loose, her voice steady. When the song ended, the bear didn't rise immediately. It sat for several long seconds, its head tilting slightly as though trying to capture the last threads of sound. Only then did it stand, turn, and walk away. That night, Eliza couldn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with a mug of tea, replaying the moment in her mind. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. The bear recognized her. It knew the song. And it was choosing to come closer. By the time May's first wildflowers began to open, the story had spread far beyond the diner. Children whispered about it in the schoolyard, farmers mentioned it over fence lines, and even the postman slowed his rounds to ask Thomas if it was true. Thomas never bragged, but he didn't deny it either. If you want to see for yourself, he told them, you'll have to wake up early. And you'll have to be quiet. The following Saturday, just after dawn, a small crowd gathered at the edge of the meadow. Samuel the postman, Clara from the bakery, a pair of teenagers still rubbing sleep from their eyes. They stood in a loose half-circle, careful to keep their distance from the center. Thomas appeared from the path, his pail in hand, moving at the same unhurried pace he always did. Moments later, the bear stepped from the pines, its massive frame haloed by slanting beams of golden light. A hush fell over the group. Even the teenagers stopped fidgeting. Thomas took a step to the right. The bear matched him. He stepped forward, then back. The bear mirrored every move, their motions slow and deliberate, like two partners who knew the rhythm without the need for music. From where they stood, the townsfolk could hear nothing but the whisper of grass underfoot and the distant call of a meadowlark. Time seemed to thicken, stretching each second until it felt like a minute. When the dance ended, Thomas set down the pail. The bear approached, ate in calm mouthfuls, and then turned toward the forest. But before disappearing into the shadows, it looked over its shoulder, not at Thomas, but at the crowd. No one moved until it was gone. Then Clara whispered, "It's real." A week later, the air had turned warm again. The meadow smelled of wild mint and damp earth, the kind of scent that reminded Eliza of her childhood summers. She carried a folded blanket under her arm, not because she planned a picnic, but because something inside her told her to stay a little longer this time. She reached her usual spot, laid the blanket in the grass, and sat cross-legged. Her knees brushed the tall stalks swaying in the evening breeze. When she began humming, the sound felt fuller somehow, rising from a place deep in her chest. The bear appeared within minutes, moving with the slow, deliberate gait she had come to know so well. But when it reached its usual place, it paused, sniffing the air, then walked forward, another 5 steps closer. Her breath caught, but she didn't stop singing. She let her gaze rest just to the side of the bear, a gesture that told it she wasn't challenging, only welcoming. It sat again, its massive paws pressed into the grass. Eliza could hear its breathing now, steady, heavy, like the rhythm of a low drum. She kept humming, her voice threading through the warm air between them. By the final note, the distance between them felt smaller than the space it actually was. She didn't stand right away. Instead, she remained seated, hands resting loosely on her knees, and watched as the bear stayed put, almost as if reluctant to leave. Eventually, it rose, took a step toward the forest, then stopped. Turning its head, it made a sound, not a growl, not a huff, but something softer, like an exhale through its nose, before disappearing into the trees. Eliza sat there long after the shadows had stretched across the meadow, her pulse still steady from the song. She realized she no longer felt fear. What she felt was recognized. It was late August when the change happened. The air carried the faintest chill of the coming fall, and the meadow's tall grass had begun to turn from green to gold. Eliza stood at the edge of her porch for a long time before heading out, watching the pine line sway in the wind. Something in her gut told her this evening would be different. When she began humming, her voice carried clear and low across the meadow. She could almost feel it weaving between the trees before the bear appeared. This time, it came at a steady pace, closing the gap until it was closer than ever before, maybe 20 feet away. She kept her tone calm, the melody unbroken. The bear sat, as always, but its gaze was sharper, more fixed. When the final note faded, Eliza waited for it to stand and leave. Instead, it stayed exactly where it was. For nearly a full minute, they watched each other in the soft evening light. Then the bear did something unexpected. It lowered its massive head toward the ground and pawed gently at the grass. Slowly, it pushed forward a small object with its nose until it rested in the open between them. Eliza's breath caught. From where she sat, she could see it was a weathered pine cone, smooth in some places, splintered in others, as though it had been carried a long way. She didn't move forward to take it. She knew better than to break the invisible boundary they had built. But her heart pounded with a strange, quiet wonder. The bear had brought something to her. After a moment, it straightened, gave that same soft exhale she'd heard once before, and then turned for the woods. When Eliza finally walked back to her cabin, she glanced over her shoulder toward the pine cone in the meadow. The bear was gone, but the gift remained. The next morning, the meadow was still damp from the night's dew. Mist clung low over the grass, swirling around Eliza's boots as she stepped off her porch. She hadn't stopped thinking about the pine cone all night. She half expected it to be gone, perhaps carried off by the wind or a curious raccoon. But there it was, right where the bear had left it, its rough edges catching the soft morning light. Eliza crouched down, hesitant at first, and picked it up. It was heavier than she'd imagined, the scales tight and dry, smelling faintly of resin and earth. She turned it over in her hands, feeling each ridge, wondering how far the bear had carried it. Instead of taking it inside, she placed it carefully on the old tree stump near the edge of the meadow, facing the forest. It felt respectful, as if she were acknowledging the gesture without claiming it as her own. That evening, when she hummed again, the bear emerged as usual. But its gaze flicked briefly toward the stump before settling back on her. She wondered, did it notice she hadn't pocketed the gift? For the next week, a strange rhythm developed. Each evening she would hum, the bear would listen, and when it left, it would return the following night with another pine cone. Some were small and freshly fallen, others were large and weathered. She arranged them carefully on the stump, one by one, until a little pile formed like an altar. The townsfolk began to notice her lingering in the meadow longer than usual, her hands clasped around something they couldn't quite see. A few asked, but she brushed off their questions. The truth felt too fragile to hand over to idle curiosity. By the end of the week, the stump held 7 pine cones, each one a silent message from the bear, each one deepening the thread of trust that bound them together. It was a Sunday evening when the peace of the meadow broke. The sky was streaked with orange and lavender, and Eliza had just begun the first verse of her humming when she heard a faint crunch of footsteps, not from the forest, but from behind her. She turned her head slightly. A man she didn't recognize was crossing the meadow, his boots sinking into the grass. He wore a hunting jacket and carried something slung over his shoulder. Eliza's heart leapt. The bear usually arrived within moments of her song, and she knew enough about wild encounters to understand how dangerous this could get. She tried to signal to the man, a subtle hand wave that said stop, go back, but he either didn't notice or didn't care. The bear emerged from the tree-line sooner than expected, its massive shape filling the space between the pines. The man froze mid-step, his hand twitching toward whatever hung at his side. Eliza's voice caught in her throat. She forced herself to keep humming, softer now, eyes locked on the bear. Something shifted in the animal's posture. Instead of focusing on the man, it stepped closer to Eliza, not in aggression, but in a way that placed its body between her and the stranger. Its head lowered slightly, shoulders squared, a silent but unmistakable warning. The man hesitated, then slowly began to back away, muttering under his breath. He didn't turn until he was near the far edge of the meadow, and even then, the bear's eyes followed him until he was gone. Only then did the bear sit, facing Eliza as though nothing had happened. She swallowed hard, her pulse still hammering, and resumed the song. The melody trembled at first, then steadied under the weight of what had just occurred. That night, she couldn't stop replaying the image in her mind, the bear choosing to stand between her and danger. It wasn't just listening anymore. It was watching over her. The morning after the confrontation in the meadow, Eliza woke to an unfamiliar feeling, safety. Not the kind she'd always associated with locks on doors or strong fences, but something deeper, older. She'd seen it in the way the bear had placed himself between her and the stranger, as if the choice had been instinctive. All day, she found herself replaying the scene. The low tilt of his head, the slow, deliberate way he'd stood his ground. It was a kind of silent language, one she realized she had been learning since that first summer evening. By dusk, she knew she couldn't keep calling him the bear in her own mind. If he was going to stand by her like that, he needed a name. That evening, she carried her blanket to the meadow as usual. The air was still warm, but the light had that unmistakable late summer softness. She began to hum, and, right on cue, he appeared, stepping from the tree-line with the slow confidence of someone who belonged there. When he reached his spot and sat, Eliza let the melody flow. Halfway through, she spoke between the lines of the tune, her voice low but sure. "I think I'll call you Rowan," she said. The bear's head tilted, ears twitching at the unfamiliar sound. She repeated it, softer this time, weaving it into the rhythm of the song. "Rowan." There was no dramatic reaction, no obvious sign of understanding, but she felt the name settle into the space between them like a stone into water. From now on, he would be Rowan, a name rooted in strength, resilience, and the quiet beauty of the forest. When the song ended, Rowan stood, gave his now familiar soft exhale, and turned back to the woods. But before vanishing among the trees, he paused, glancing back at her one last time. That night, she wrote his name in her journal, underlined twice. Naming him hadn't made him hers, nothing could. But it had given their connection a shape she could carry. The days grew shorter, the evenings cooler. Leaves at the edge of the forest began to bronze and curl, and the meadow smelled faintly of dry grass and wood smoke from distant chimneys. Eliza had grown used to the sight of Rowan each night, but she never assumed what he might do next. With a wild creature, every moment was still a choice, his choice. That evening, she sat on her blanket as always, the familiar melody drifting into the cooling air. Rowan emerged sooner than expected, his fur catching the last streaks of sunlight. But instead of stopping at his usual distance, he kept moving forward, one step, then another, each deliberate and slow. Eliza's pulse quickened. She kept her humming steady, though her voice had dropped lower without her realizing it. When Rowan finally stopped, he was close enough that she could see the individual strands of his fur, damp at the tips from brushing against meadow grass. His eyes were darker up close, deep pools that caught tiny reflections of the fading light. For a long, breathless moment, they simply looked at each other. Eliza could hear his breathing, slow, heavy, and warm in the cooling evening air. She didn't move, afraid to break the fragile trust that hung between them. Then Rowan did something she never could have predicted. He lowered his massive head until it hovered just inches from her knees, nostrils flaring as he took in her scent. She could feel the heat of his breath against her skin, the faint tickle of it through the fabric of her jeans. Eliza kept humming, her voice trembling only slightly now. Rowan stayed like that for what felt like an eternity before lifting his head and stepping back, not in retreat, but in a calm, deliberate way, as if to say he had seen enough for today. When he turned toward the forest, Eliza released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Something had shifted again, another invisible thread pulled taut between them. The first snow came early that year. By mid-afternoon, the meadow lay under a soft, unbroken blanket of white, the grass bowed beneath its weight. The forest beyond stood dark and still, each pine bough heavy with frost. Eliza pulled on her thick coat and boots, pausing at the window. She had no idea if Rowan would come in this weather. Bears were supposed to be retreating into their dens by now, preparing for the long winter ahead. But habit, and something deeper, told her to go. She trudged through the snow, each step a muffled crunch. At her usual spot, she brushed away enough snow to sit on her folded blanket. Her breath came out in visible clouds as she began to hum. The sound felt different in the cold air, sharper, cleaner, carrying farther. For several minutes, nothing stirred. Then, from between the dark pines, a familiar shape emerged. Rowan moved slowly, his thick winter coat dusted with snowflakes. His paws left deep prints behind him as he crossed the white meadow. When he reached her, he didn't sit at his usual distance. Instead, he stopped just a few feet away, lowering his head in that same way he had weeks earlier. The snow clung to the fur around his face, melting slowly in the heat of his breath. Eliza kept humming, her voice warm against the cold. Rowan stayed there for the entire song, unblinking, as if memorizing every note. When she finished, he gave one slow exhale, the soft sound she had come to know, and stepped back. This time, he turned toward the forest without hesitation, but not before glancing back once, his dark eyes locking with hers. She knew it was goodbye for now. As his shape vanished into the trees, Eliza sat a little longer, the snow settling around her. Their visits had become something more than chance, they were a ritual, a promise renewed with each meeting. And come spring, when the meadow thawed, she would be there, humming the song that had brought him out of the woods.